Dr. G with Wonderful Wednesdays. Hey, guess what tomorrow is? It's not Christmas. Too soon. It's not July 4th. We already had that. And it's not Easter. The Easter Bunny is not here. It is Constitution Day!
Woo-hoo.
September 17th. What year was the Constitution ratified?
2012?
No, you're wrong. I don't remember, but I'm sure Dr. G knows for sure. But it was not 2012.
Yeah, you're
But
right.
on September 17th, way back when, it was ratified. By how many people? The whole country, huh?
By the state, well, no.
We're going to backtrack.
It's more complicated than that.
We're going to backtrack. So we've got Dr. G here to tell us a little bit about the U.S. Constitution. Then he's going to quiz me because I know everything almost about it.
Yeah, just like we saw.
Take it away, Dr. G.
All right, thanks. The Constitution is actually our second form of government. Do you know what our first form of government was?
No.
It was the Articles of Confederation. And it didn't work well because there were a lot of problems with it. We're not going to get into the problems, but people realized it was created during the American Revolution, and then when the revolution was over, people realized this government isn't working very well. The U.S. was falling apart, and people were concerned that this new country of ours would split in two. Maybe the British would take back part of it, or who knows what would happen. And people began to realize that we needed to modify or to amend the first form of government, the Articles of Confederation. So a group of delegates got together. There are 55 of them.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. And they gathered in Philadelphia, and the year was 1787.
17, not 2012.
Not 2012.
And I bet 55 people don't come to a consensus, an agreement, very easily.
No, they didn't, and not all 55 were there all the time. Some would come in and leave and go back, and it took a while. And it was in the summertime, so it was hot and humid in Philadelphia. They actually spent a lot of time in the evenings in taverns making deals, rather than just debating during the day. But only 12 of the 13 states were represented. There was one state that didn't send any representatives to the Constitutional Convention.
What state was that?
That was Rhode Island.
They didn't want a stake in the game?
Well, they were afraid that the government would become too strong.
Okay.
They got the nickname of Rogues Island, like a rogue is a bad guy. But the men who were there, and they're all men, women were not allowed to have a say in government back then.
We could have handled it quickly.
I can make all kinds of comments about that, about what kind of government we'd have. But they were all white men because only white people could be involved in government. And they were typically pretty rich, and they were educated. So some of the famous people who we know were there, like Ben Franklin was there, George Washington was there, and James Madison was there. And he became known as the father of the Constitution because he, more than anybody else, realized we got to scrap the Articles of Confederation and start new and start with the Constitution. And so he was really big into political theory. So he had an idea of what to do. And as you kind of pointed out, these guys didn't agree about much of anything. And so there are two big ideas that we want you to understand about the Constitution. One is it was full of compromises. And number two, there's something important in it called the separation of powers. So let's talk about compromises first. What's a compromise? At least in our household, it's I do whatever she wants.
I like that compromise.
Yeah, I know.
It's when two people who have different opinions come together and agree on something.
Right, and so they change their views a little bit. It's like you meet in the middle. So it's like you don't get everything you want, but you get some of what you want. Well, that was true with...
And you make the best of it.
That's true. For 25 years. So the states that had big populations, a lot of people in them, like New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia, they wanted just one House of Congress, and it would be represented, the bigger states would have more people, so they'd have more power. Whereas the smaller states like New Jersey and Connecticut, they wanted equal representation. So every state would have, one representative or two representatives, and so everybody would be equal. That was a big point of contention between, or fighting between the people. And so what they did is they came up with the Great Compromise. It seems obvious in retrospect, but at the time they couldn't figure it out for a long time. So what we have is we have one House of Congress, which is the House of Representatives, which is based on the amount of people in a state. So the more people you have, the more representatives you have. What's our most populous state, do you know?
Wyoming.
That's on the other end. Wyoming, I think, is probably the least populous state. So they have one.
They have more cows.
Yeah. So they have one representative, but I think California is our most populous state. So they've got a lot of representatives. So in the House of Representatives, California has more power than Wyoming. But you go to the Senate.
And we each have two
right.
senators.
So Wyoming has two senators. California has two senators. That's a compromise.
Yeah.
Another compromise. There were lots of them, but the other one that I'll mention had to do with slavery. Now, slavery existed in all of the colonies at one time during the American Revolution, and then the northern colonies and northern states slowly began to get rid of slavery. So, Massachusetts didn't have slavery anymore by 1787 for the most part, but Virginia did, and South Carolina did. The states that had slaves wanted to protect slavery, and some of the states that didn't have slaves wanted to begin to eliminate slavery everywhere. But there were several compromises over slavery. One is that the word slave or slavery does not appear in the Constitution.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, there's always something like persons held to service. It's a way of calling someone a slave without using that word. But to appease people who wanted to get rid of slavery, after 20 years, the federal government could outlaw the importation of new slaves from Africa to the United States. But on the other hand, in the original Constitution, there's something called the Fugitive Slave Clause, which meant that the federal government was responsible for tracking down, arresting, and returning slaves who had run away, or enslaved people who had run away from their plantations.
Yeah.
So that makes slavery stronger.
Right.
And then there's some other compromises we don't have time to go into. But so those are the compromises. Now let's talk a little bit about separation of powers. But I want to ask you a question about the library.
Yeah.
What kinds of people work at the library?
Fun people.
No, that's not what I'm
Smart
asking.
people.
What are
Creative people.
What are different jobs that people do at the library? Like
okay.
different job titles for people at the library.
There are people that catalog books.
Okay.
So.
No,
Oh, okay.
don't give me an example.
Okay. There are people that do the technology.
Yeah.
There are people that do customer service.
Right.
Is that good?
Yeah. People who clean the library.
Clean
right?
the library.
People who repair the library.
Yes.
If there's damage and
Yes.
things. Yeah, so it's important to have people doing different jobs.
Yeah, you're right.
Because not everybody can do the same job, not everybody's qualified to do the same thing. Well, that's kind of like the separation of powers is you and the three branches of government is they're doing different jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So I see we have some sheets of paper. So for our three branches of government, you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch. And they have separate jobs. So for instance, in the executive branch, that's the president. And that's the cabinet, because he appoints the people in the cabinet. And the executive enforces the laws, if that makes sense. Let's go to so the legislative branch is different. That's Congress, that's the House of Representatives like we talked about, and that's the Senate. They initiate the laws. So all laws start in either the House or in the Senate, and then if both of them pass them together, then it goes to the executive branch, and the president can decide whether or not he or she someday probably will want that bill to become a law. But just because it's a law doesn't mean it necessarily squares with the Constitution. So the judicial branch determines if there's a problem, if a law is constitutional or not.
The interpretation.
They interpret the laws, right?
Right.
So the judicial branch is the Supreme Court and other courts as well.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Makes sense to
So,
me.
so another way of like the separation of powers, but also the separation of duties, is in war and money. Congress has the power of the budget, and laws about the budget have to originate in the House of Representatives, and then it goes to the president, and then he can implement it. Another one is war. The president is the commander-in-chief of the army, but he can't declare war. Congress declares war. So what you're trying to have this compromise and this separation of powers so that one branch of government isn't too strong, so you don't have a dictatorship, or a really strong government that's going to trample on people's rights.
Yeah.
So we're going to do a quiz.
Yeah.
Now, she isn't prepped for this. I'm going to list some people in our government, and you have to tell me what branch of government they're from.
Okay.
So let's start with an easy one. The president.
Oh. Executive branch.
Very-
Ding, 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 ding.
Very good. How about a Supreme Court justice?
Judicial branch.
Nicely done. How about Speaker of the House?
House of Representative. Legislative.
That's the
branch.
legislative branch. That's correct. Maybe these two are too easy.
'Cause I'm
How
smart.
about the Attorney General?
Ooh. I'm gonna go with judicial.
It is the executive branch because
He's an attorney.
the president appoints him.
Oh.
He's the chief law enforcement officer, the Attorney General
Okay.
in our country. How about a law clerk? Most likely what branch is
oh.
judicial, yeah, that's right.
Got that right.
And then one last one, you'll get this one right. Speaker of the House. Legislative, yeah, she got it right.
I only missed one. That's not so
And
bad.
just a bonus question. How old do you have to be to vote in federal elections?
18.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. G. Something that I learned when I was doing my research on the Constitution was that the people that met at the Constitutional Convention were two parties.
Not yet.
They weren't yet, but they called themselves Federalist and Anti-Federalist.
Yeah.
Look it up. Also, very interesting, states' rights and then strong national government.
Right,
Between the two.
right.
That's all I'm going to say about it. Also, visit the National Constitution Center. It's www.constitutioncenter.org. Lots of online activities to help you meet and learn a little bit about the 55 men that were in the room. I'm going to borrow from Hamilton.
In the room where it happened.
The room where it happened. Interactive activities. Lots of things to help you learn about our U.S. Constitution even more. Also, another resource that's been around since I was a kid is Schoolhouse Rock. I'm just a bill sitting here on Capitol Hill. So you can check that out from the library, and it's got great information about our government. We've got nonfiction books, and one of my favorite illustrators and authors, David Catro, took the preamble, the intro to the Constitution, and illustrated it. So a great book to help you understand big words.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's not written in the language that I use every day. So awesome resources at your public library. Hopefully you learned something and go out and celebrate tomorrow.
Constitution Day.
Constitution Day!